Hello and welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. In this video I'm going to cover the basics of drawing in the paint method. I'm going to cover drawing ovals, drawing rectangles, changing colors, and drawing lines. And we're going to kind of put them all together and draw a rudimentary flower in our basic paint template. So let's start out with the very basics of drawing here. I'm going to bring up this example called drawingBasics, and we'll look at the code from top down. We've got the class header just like always, drawingBasics extends JFrame. We've got our main method where we're doing all the same things that we always do. We instantiate our object from our class, drawingBasics frame, gets new drawingBasics, and then on that frame we're going to set the size. I'm saying it's 600 by 600. On that frame, I'm setting the default close operations, exit on close, and setting visible to true. We've done this on all the videos so far. It's not going to change. I'm probably not going to talk about this much more in any of the future videos. Now in the last video I talked about with the basic paint template, we introduced the paint method. We're going to be using this in all of the programs that we do in future videos for this unit at least. So I've got the paint method here. Public void paint takes in graphics G. Once again, the paint method is a method that comes from the JFrame, and what it does is it automatically invokes when the frame comes into existence. So when I run this, Java is going to look for the main. It launches the main implicitly. In other words, it does it automatically in the background without us having to do anything. We're going to instantiate the frame, and as soon as we set it visible to true, that's when the graphics context comes into being, and that's when the paint method here is going to invoke. When the paint method invokes, the graphics context is taken in from the JFrame into the parameter. We don't have to do anything. Like you'll notice, we don't have to call paint anywhere. Just like we don't call main anywhere. They automatically are invoked by Java. So the paint method gets invoked. It takes in the graphics context from our JFrame, and then we have to make this call to super paint. And as I said before, I'm not going to explain that in depth. Just know that you have to do it in order for this to work properly. All right, in the last video we saw the basics of drawing a rectangle and an oval. And when I run this one, the drawingBasics, you can see that I've got my rectangle here and my oval here. Well, in the previous one, we had some problems. When I drew my oval, I thought I was drawing it to the center. I drew it at 300 and 300 because my frame was 600 by 600, but it showed up in the lower right-hand quadrant. And I said I wanted you to kind of puzzle through this and think about why this might have happened. It didn't draw it in the center at all. It drew it down in the lower right-hand corner. And I said it had something to do with things that we talked about in previous videos. Well, in previous videos, we saw that wherever we place the origin of a string that we draw to the frame, that's the upper left-hand corner of that string. We think of that string as being an invisible box with a string drawn into it. And the upper left-hand corner of that box is the origin. That's where we set our x and y. Well, ovals and rectangles are no different. Let's take a look at this fillRect. G.fillRect. I set it the x to 10, the y to 40, and I set it 100 by 100. So there are 4 arguments in fillRect and in filloval. DrawRect and drawOval are going to be almost identical, but what fill does is it fills them in with a solid color. Draw will just make a line on the outer edge. So if we look at where 10 and 40 are, 10 is right here, this is 40 down. Now here's something, I want to show you this. If I were to set this at 0 and 0, my origin for my rectangle at 0 and 0, and I made it 100 by 100, if I run this, you're going to see that my rectangle is off the screen, and it doesn't look like it's 100 by 100. In fact, it's a little less than 100 wide, and it's quite a bit less than 100 high. Let's talk about how the graphics context works within a frame. You'll notice that the frame is this big box that's got a little bit of a border. It's got about a 10 pixel border on left, bottom, and right, and it's got this bar along the top here that is probably, what, about 30 or 40 pixels, okay? Well, the graphics context is overlapped by those bars on the top and on the sides. So the graphics context goes underneath them. If I set this to 10x, you'll see it's going to bump my rectangle over and bring it into the page. Okay, that's about a 5 pixel, maybe 3 pixel gap there. I don't know exactly, but you can see that this bar here is overlapping the graphics context by just a little bit. In other words, the graphics are going off of the frame just a little bit. I'm going to set my Y just a little bit lower. I'm going to set it at 40. And it comes down here. So this is 40, and you can see it's about 10 pixels down. If I set it at 30, it should be almost touching the top border. There we go. It's actually touching it. Okay. I'm going to set it to 32 and see if I can get a little gap there, and I want to try and figure out where that, how much space that bar actually takes up. I'm guessing that bar takes up just about 30 pixels of the graphics context. So it overlaps the graphics context by about 30 pixels. This is something that we have to keep in mind whenever we're doing drawing, because the left edge, the right edge, the bottom edge, and the top edge are all going to overlap the graphics by just a little bit. Okay? So that's how the graphics context works within the frame. All right. Now, as I was saying before I got to this point, is that the upper left-hand corner of our shape is our X and Y origin. So I set my X and Y origin here to 32 and 10. So it's 10 over and 32 down. And then it's drawn from that upper left-hand corner down and to the right. In graphics in Java, I said this before when we were talking about strings, is that as you increase the Y, it moves lower and lower and lower in the frame. As you increase the X, it moves further and further to the right. Sometimes this is a little bit opposite of what you would think, because when we think of increasing something, we think of it going up, right? Now, increasing and going to the right, that just kind of makes sense to us, because as you increase things, as you increase distance from the edge of a page where your reading starts, it's going to go to the right. But when we think of things getting bigger, we think of them getting taller and higher. Well, that's not the way it works. As we increase the Y, it's going to go down in the frame. Okay, so you got to keep that in mind. Now, with those things together, thinking about the origin being in the upper left-hand corner and then things increasing as they go down and to the right, you can try and figure out how to draw something directly on center. So what I've done is I've drawn this, filled this oval directly on center on the frame. I made the oval 300 pixels wide by 300 pixels high, and I set it at 150 and 150. Now technically that's not exactly on center. If I wanted it to be on center, I would have to bump the Y down by about 30, and I'd have to bump the X over by about 10, and that would be more close to on center. There we go. Now my oval is pretty much exactly on center. So this and this and this and this are all the same distances. All I did is I figured out how wide and how tall I wanted my oval, and then I divided that in half. And then I offset my X and Y by half the distance. Now why is that? So if the center is right here, the center of the frame is right there, and the origin of my oval is right here. It's not on the edge of the oval. It's actually, the oval is drawn inside of a box. So the origin is right up there. This is about 150 over to the left and about 150 down, because it's the half. half of it. If I want to have the center of my oval on the center, the center of my oval is half the width of the oval and half the height of the oval. So I subtract half of the width and half of the height, and then I offset my origin by that distance. Okay? So if I set this, what I thought was on center, 300 and 300, like we saw in the other video, it's pushing it down and to the right. See? That's not what I was looking for. I need to now offset it so that the center is on center. So subtract half the width, 150, well, we'll say 160, and then half of the height, that would be 150, but with our offset, it's 180. And there it's on center. Great. I'm not going to belabor this one anymore. I think you kind of get how things are drawn to the graphics context and how they show up within the frame. Let's take a look at drawing some other things now. I first want to address drawing with color. We looked at how to use color in a previous video. So this is just a new class, Drawing with Color Extends JFrame. We've got all the stuff that we normally do with the JFrame. And in the paint method, I'm using the set color. So in a previous video, we were talking about this with fonts. You can set the color and it'll change the color of a drawstring. I'm calling set color to the graphics context. So g.setColor, color green, and then I fill my rect, and then g.setColor, color red, and I fill my oval. When I run this one, you're going to see that my green rectangle is drawing first and my red oval is drawing second. Now I set these ones on center, just like I showed you before. I used that half width and half height offset and subtracted those from the from where I was thinking about putting the origin, which would have been on center, and I subtract that. Now, oval is drawing on top of the rectangle, and let's see why that is. On this next project, you have to think about how things actually draw. You want to think of these things drawing kind of in a vertical stack along the z-axis. If there's an x, y, and z, z is the axis that's coming out of the screen towards us. Well, there is a stack of things drawn on the graphics context on that z-axis, okay? And whatever is drawn first is going to be below other things. So if I draw my oval, or I mean my rectangle first, it gets drawn to the graphics context. Then I set my color, change it to red, and I fill my oval, and it's going to draw it on top of that rectangle. Okay, so it draws the rectangle first, and then it draws the oval on top of it. If I switch these around, if I draw my rectangle first, and then my oval second, I'm going to have a problem. Or pardon me, if I draw my oval first and my rectangle second, I'm going to have a problem. The rectangle is covering up the oval because the oval was drawn completely inside of the rectangle. Well, the oval got drawn first. Next, the rectangle gets drawn, and it's just going to cover up what we saw before. So when you're doing drawings and you're thinking about how things are going to overlap, you have to think carefully about what's going to get drawn first, second, third, fourth within your frame. I'm going to fix this. All right. Now, I want to talk about drawing lines, and that's going to be the last thing that I talk about in this video. Lines are very simple. G dot draw line. And all you have to do is indicate the start point and end point. So there's going to be an X and a Y at every point. And if I want it to start at 10 and 10, I'd set the X and a Y. So this is X starting, this is Y starting. So X, Y origin, and then I've got to pick my endpoint. Let's say I want it to go up to 150 and 150. So this is my start point, this is my end point. If I run this, you should see a line show up. There you go. It's actually underneath the rectangle a little bit. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to step through doing a basic drawing of a simple flower. The flower is going to be a ball on a stick inside of a frame, and that's it. Okay? So let's go to our painting template. And I'm going to take out this draw oval and this draw string from the previous video, and I'm going to start by making a rectangle. I'm going to put my rectangle roughly on center. It's going to be taller than it is wide. So G dot draw rect. And I'm going to first think about the width and height. If my frame is 600 by 600, I want it to be about half the width. So I'll make it 300 wide. And then for the height, I want it to be almost as tall as the frame. So the frame is 600, so I'm going to make it 500 high. So width, height. Now, I have not defined my first two arguments. I got to define the x and the y. So if I wanted it to show up on center, I would have to figure out what the center is. So center of my frame is 600 and 600. Okay? Now with that in mind, it's 300 wide. The rectangle that I'm drawing is 300 wide. So if I wanted the rectangle to show up on center horizontally, I'd need to divide this 300 in half and subtract that from where I want it to show up. So if 300 pardon me, the center is 300 and 300, not 600 and 600. So if my center is 300 and 300, and I have to have an offset that's half the width, I would subtract 150 from that, and 150 is roughly the center horizontally. Now I got to figure out the center vertically. So if the center of the frame is 300 and 300, and my rectangle is 500 high, half of the height is 250. So I'd have to subtract that from 300. So my y origin would then be 50. Let's see if this worked the way I wanted it to work. There we go. Yep, it's roughly centered vertically and horizontally. All right, you can see that they're just slightly offset here. Now, this is a little bit shorter here than it is down here, and that's because the graphics context is getting covered up right here. I might want to shove this down just a little bit. I'm going to see where it looks good. I'm going to first try it at 60 and see what it looks like. And that's pretty close. It looks pretty much even there and there. Great. So I've got my frame where I'm going to draw my flower. Now I'm going to draw the head of the flower. The head of the flower is going to be an oval. G dot fill oval. And I want it to be on center with this. So I got to think about how wide I want it to be. I don't want it to be 300 wide. I want it to be a little bit less. So I want it to be about 200 wide, and I want it to be a circle, so 200 high. Now if it's 200 and 200 and I need it on center, that's going to be a 100 pixel offset from the center. So that would be, my center is 300 by 300, so I subtract 100 from 300, put it at 200, subtract 100 from 300, and that would be about 200. But I don't want to do that, because if I put it at 200, it's going to be perfectly on center on the frame. I want my oval to show up here. So I've got to look at where my x origin of the frame is, and I want to get a similar distance here and here. Okay? So let's figure out what that distance is. If this frame is 300 wide and my oval is 100 wide, that gives me a 50 pixel gap here and a 50 pixel gap here. So I want a 50 pixel gap here. That means 50 down from the origin of my frame. If my y origin of the frame is 60 and I want to be 50 down from that, that would put me at 110 for my y origin for my oval. Let's look at it and see how it looks. That looks just about right. I've got the same gap here as I've got here as I've got here. Great. Now, I just want to draw a little stick that's going to draw down here, so it's going to be kind of like a flower, right? It's got a stem and it's got a flower head. G dot, draw a line. Now, we got to think about where we want our starting x and starting y, ending x and ending y to be. We know that the x is going to be perfectly on center, so that's easy. We know that's 300. We also know that our oval is 200 high, and that the origin of our oval is right here at 110. So 110 plus 200, that's 310. It's going to be 310 pixels down. And then now we got to think about where we want it to end. I want it to go almost down to the bottom of the rectangle. The rectangle is 500 high. Its origin is at 60. That means the bottom is at 560 for the y value. Okay? I want it to be about 50 up. So I think 510 is where I want it to show up. If we want this a vertical line, the x is going to be the same, so 300, and the y is going to be 510. Run it and see how it looks. And there, I've got a very simple, well, balloon. It's supposed to be a flower. If I wanted this to be more of a stem, I might use a rectangle, make it a little wider. If I really wanted to make this look like a flower, I would maybe change the colors of things, maybe add some petals, more details. You saw those examples that I showed earlier. But this is a start. This is roughly a template for how you're going to start drawing your flowers in your flower project. Now, you have to have 4 flowers, just like I showed you in those examples, 4 different frames, each with a flower in it. You also have to have text that describes each flower. So this is just a start to get you on your way. Tune in for the next videos where we'll start talking about arcs, we'll start talking about setting things relative to the frame, and then just kind of putting it all together. Thanks for watching.